You're talking a lot about lipopolysaccharides and bacteria. I'd like you to walk the folks through kind of their danger. I've experienced, and I know you have too, the prevalent association between water damaged buildings, mold, and also bacteria growing in the environment. And
Yes.
you have mold toxins, but then you also have bacterial toxins that are released. Could you walk us through those bacterial toxins and kind of what are some of the symptoms? What would people do to recognize whether or not that was part of what was impacting them? And the reason I ask that specifically is because sometimes people will come to my clinic and other doctors' clinics, and they'll maybe have been tested for mold, but they haven't been tested for bacterial toxins. And maybe they didn't test positive for the mold, and so they've dismissed that as a potential possibility.
Yes. Critically important. I think the first and most important concept for the general public in wanting to be healthier is to understand that the root mechanism of disease is always inflammation. Almost always, 95% of the time. So when they understand that, then they start thinking, what is my immune system trying to protect me from? Then it leads into where the exposure is coming from that are activating that immune system to protect you. And lipopolysaccharides is at the very top. To tell you how important it is, and what most doctors don't talk about, I'll talk about this today in my lecture here at this conference that we're at, is that lipopolysaccharides accumulate in your body over the years, and they accumulate in your brain. It's the primary trigger for the production of amyloid in the brain. Amyloid is not bad for you. We hear, oh, beta amyloid, it's the Alzheimer's thing. Yes, that is the Alzheimer's thing, but beta amyloid is a response of your immune system to fight bacteria or bacterial exhaust that got into your brain. And it's really interesting, that the researchers, these guys are geeks and they have their own way of speaking and all that, but they call the amyloid, there's many different types of amyloid depending on what type of bacteria has gotten into your brain, but they call them Lego peptides, like Legos, like the toys. We both got kids that play with Legos, right? They call them Legos because they're different shapes of amyloid depending on what bacteria you've been exposed to. I get a little joy out of seeing whoever thought that one up is trying to give an example that people can understand, visualize, oh, Legos. So beta amyloid is the production of beta amyloid in the brain. It's the most, lipopolysaccharide is most potent and common trigger of beta amyloid in the brain. And as beta amyloid continues to accumulate in the brain, because you keep having leaky gut, which goes to leaky brain, and so you get these bacteria and the bacterial exhaust that go into the brain, you keep making amyloid to try to wall this stuff off. And that's the job of beta amyloid, is to wall off the bacteria, put it in like this big shell that it can't get out of, so the immune system doesn't have to fight it anymore and reduces the inflammation, right? That's what beta amyloid is. It's a protective mechanism. And the million-dollar question is, what is it trying to protect you from? So there's two categories of bacteria. We call them gram-negative and gram-positive. The gram-negative bacteria are the majority of the bad guys that we're exposed to. And we all have some bad guys in our gut. Our ancestors were exposed to it all the time, so their immune systems developed ways to fight this stuff in the gut so that it didn't get out of the gut into the bloodstream. Once it gets in the bloodstream, because of a leaky gut, which is very, very common in our world today, was not so common 10,000 years ago, right? But now it is today. And so this bacteria gets into the bloodstream. And the bloodstream's just a highway. It's all the traffic's going in the same direction, but there's no lanes of traffic, so everything's just in there. And when it gets up to the brain, if you have a leaky gut, the mechanism that caused leaky gut will also contribute to causing a leaky brain. And so what's in the bloodstream that might be okay, might not be okay in the bloodstream, it gets into the brain because of a leaky brain. And it's not supposed to be in the brain. The molecules are too big. And that activates the immune system of the brain trying to protect you, which creates the inflammation to kill this thing inside the brain. And then you get the collateral damage from the explosions. I refer to the immune system in the brain. We have 4 immune systems. This is getting a little geeky now, but in the gut, most of the immune system in the gut is like the sheriff in town. He's got a 6-shooter, to keep the peace, right? Then in the bloodstream, you've got the marshal. The marshal has a much larger area than the town that he's responsible for. He's got a rifle, maybe a Winchester, or, I grew up with cowboys, so maybe it's a Winchester, right? But in the brain, you've got an immune system that's special forces with laser-guided bullets. And their job is to just eliminate anything that gets in there, right? If that happens once or twice, no big deal. But if it's continual because a person's eating French fries and all the bad fats that cause leaky gut, and all those bad fats in the bloodstream will cause a leaky brain, now you got molecules getting into the brain on a regular basis because of the garbage that people are eating. And then you've got the immune system in the brain trying to protect you, firing these laser bullets. You get collateral damage in the brain. And when you get collateral damage because of these bazooka explosions in the brain, you get this collateral damage. Now you've damaged the brain tissue. Now your immune system is going to make antibodies to fight the damaged brain tissue, to get rid of that stuff. It's old and damaged stuff, so you want to get rid of it, right? That's why we do a test that looks at 55 different markers of inflammation in the brain. We're looking to see how much damage is accruing in the brain right now. Critically important concept. Now, with all that geeky stuff, sorry about all that, but I hope it gives a picture of what we're dealing with. The gram-negative bacteria have a vest. I call it a vest that protects that bacteria, so when it gets into a mammal, whether it's a horse or a human or a rabbit, whatever animal it gets into, the immune system of that mammal tries to kill that gram-negative bacteria. But it's got a vest, and the immune system can't damage the vest. That vest is called lipopolysaccharides. So sometimes our immune system can kind of squeak in there and kill the bacteria. Might be Klebsiella, might be Pseudomonas, there's many different types it could be, and it'll kill the bacteria, but you still have the vest that got in through the leaky gut into the bloodstream. That's called LPS, lipopolysaccharides. It's the vest of the gram-negative bacteria, and your immune system cannot kill lipopolysaccharide. And doctors don't know this, but it accumulates in your tissue, it accumulates in the brain, it accumulates in your liver, it accumulates in your muscles, it accumulates in your gallbladder, it accumulates in your tissue over a lifetime. That's why it's called endotoxin. Endo means inside. Endotoxin, inside, the toxins inside the body are lipopolysaccharides that come from this bad bacteria that we all get a little exposure to, but because of the leaky gut, we get a lot of it in our body. It deposits in the tissue, it accumulates over a lifetime, and you just Google LPS for lipopolysaccharides and sepsis, and you see the studies. LPS is the cause of sepsis. Endotoxin is what sepsis is. Now, sepsis is I think it's number 1 or number 2 killer of elders in hospitals. Hundreds of thousands die a year in the US from sepsis. My mother died from sepsis, and at the time I didn't know any of this stuff, which is what got me so interested in it, to figure out what happened here. How come? And so now we've got a really good picture of what this is. So LPS And people haven't heard of LPS, but it's the number one trigger. There are two things. Our friend and mentor, Professor Alessio Fasano at Harvard. So to give the audience a sense of this guy, professor of medicine, Harvard Medical School, professor of nutrition, Harvard School of Public Health, the chief of pediatric gastroenterology at Mass General at Harvard, the director of the Celiac Research Center at Harvard, the director of Mucosal Immunology Center at Harvard. 5 titles. Any one title is a lifelong dream for someone at the top of their game. Now, I know we've talked before, we think he's going to win the Nobel Prize because it was him and his team that identified the mechanism of leaky gut back in 1997, how this thing occurs. And they've been publishing about it ever since. He's always so careful about what he says because he can be misquoted so easily, right? Mm-hmm. And you'll see a paper, there's over 350 research papers with his name on them. You know, there might be 6 authors on the paper, but the last one, Alessio Fasano, the boss, the stamp of approval, okay, this can go now, right? This paper he wrote himself, which gives us a sense of how important the paper is. And he wants to make sure that the world understands this. The title of the paper, All Disease Begins in the, quote, leaky gut. The role of zonulin, the protein zonulin, in the development of chronic inflammatory diseases. And 14 of the 15 top causes of death are chronic inflammatory diseases. And Fasano's telling us all disease begins in the leaky gut. And in that paper, he tells us the 2 most powerful triggers to create leaky gut, which means, and that's the gateway in the development of autoimmune diseases. The 2 most powerful triggers are gluten and LPS. So they should be at the top of every doctor's list of what they test for. Is this patient's immune system fighting wheat? Any of the peptides of wheat, not just gluten, but any of the peptides of wheat. And is this patient's immune system fighting LPS? There are the 2 top triggers of inflammation, which is the root mechanism of 14 of the 15 top causes of death. And when you put it in that perspective, it's like, oh my God. And LPS is accumulating in the body over a lifetime called endotoxin, and that is the cause of sepsis. So when you start to understand this bigger picture, it's not just, well, I feel fine today, you know, I don't feel too bad. But the mechanism, one more study, if I may, because it helps to put it in perspective. Back in 2017, most every newspaper in the country said, Medicare projected to go bankrupt in 20 to 30 years because of Alzheimer's. You may remember seeing those stories in the news. It was a front page of most newspapers for a day or two. And then the government put together a commission of the best experts in the world that they could find to figure out, what are we going to do about this? What are we going to do? So they came together. It took them 2 years to write their report. And when they wrote their report, there was a graph in that report that said it all. It just said it all. So I'm going to give you a little background information, and then I'll talk about the report and what it said. 20-some years ago, and I know you and I have talked about this study before, Dr. Melissa Arbuckle was at the VA, and she looked for people with lupus in this one VA center, the autoimmune disease lupus, and she found 136, I think it was, patients with lupus. Now, if they're in a VA center, they're veterans. If they're veterans, they were in the armed forces. If they were in the armed forces, they had their blood drawn many times over the years when they were healthy in the Navy or the Air Force or the Marines. And what most people don't know is that the government's been saving and freezing almost all of that blood since 1978. They've got tens of millions of samples of our service people's blood. Dr. Arbuckle knew this, and she asked for permission to look at the blood of the currently diagnosed lupus patients when they were healthy in the Army. What did their blood look like? And she got permission. There are 7 antibodies that cause lupus. And she found that every single patient had every single antibody elevated 5 years before they ever had a symptom. No symptoms whatsoever. They felt fine. But they had elevated antibodies that by definition is killing off tissue, killing off tissue, killing off tissue. Some of the antibodies were elevated 11 years beforehand, killing off tissue, killing off tissue. But all of them, it was 5 years. So she did a graph in her research paper, and she showed first you have normal immunity, which means you have a normal level of antibodies to your thyroid. When we do a blood test for autoimmune thyroid disease, there's a reference range usually to 34 to 36, depending on the lab, right? Why is it normal to have 22 antibodies to your thyroid? Why is that normal? Because it's part of the process of autophagy, which means getting rid of the old and damaged cells to make room for new cells. Mrs. Patient, you have an entire new body every couple of years. Every cell in your body regenerates. How does that happen? You have to get rid of the old and damaged cells to make room for the new ones. And antibodies are a part of that process. So there's a normal level of antibodies. But when you have elevated antibodies, you're killing off more cells than you're making. Okay? But you feel fine. Well, Dr. Arbuckle showed us that this was going on years before people ever had a symptom because they hadn't killed off enough tissue yet. And she did this drawing that said first you have normal immunity, so the antibody load is normal, a little bit normal. Then you have what she referred to as benign autoimmunity. Well, it's not benign, it's killing off more tissue than it's making, but there's no symptoms. Then you have pathogenic, where you have symptoms, and then you get a diagnosis, as if you got lupus here. But you actually got lupus way back over there when the antibodies were elevated. You were on the spectrum of autoimmune development, right? So she showed us that. Now, the easiest way for clinicians like you and me to turn that around is if you can get to it before there's so much tissue damage that they've got symptoms. And that period before symptoms is called the prodromal period. It comes from a Greek word prodromos or something, it means before, right? So before symptoms. That prodromal period where Dr. Arbuckle referred to as benign, elevated antibodies but no symptoms. If you can identify it there, then you've got a really good, it's not easy, but it's easier to turn it around, right? So now, back to the Alzheimer's Commission group. It took them 2 years to publish their study. It came out in February of 2019. No one paid attention to it July of 2019. And no one paid attention because that's when the virus came out. And so everyone was terrified of the virus and nobody listened to what these guys said. And they did their drawing. And when you see this drawing, wait, what? Because they show, and they refer to it as the prodromal period of Alzheimer's. What does that mean? It means before symptoms. The prodromal period goes for 20 to 25 years of elevated inflammation in the brain, killing off tissue, killing off tissue, killing off tissue. And the primary trigger for all of that is lipopolysaccharides, LPS. It's so bad that now the research is just shocking when you see this. Now, every single child by age 14.8 years was the average. Every single child in Mexico City has evidence of Alzheimer's. Every one. When they do MRIs, they see the plaque, they see the mechanisms of it. Everyone. Because the air pollution, which contains LPS in it, along with particulate matter, is so extreme there. Okay, that's Mexico City. That doesn't relate to us. Really? February 2019, once again, that same time period, No one paid attention to Blue Cross Blue Shield. And they came out with a report saying, we've got a problem. And they showed that in the previous 4-year period, now this is just a for-profit insurance company, they showed that in the previous 4-year period, there was a 407% increase in the diagnosis of mild Alzheimer's in 30 to 44-year-olds in 4 years. Wait, what? 407% increase in claims in 30 to 44-year-olds in 4 years? Yes. Yes, because people are getting sicker at younger ages. They're more of the bad foods causing the leaky gut. The LPS is getting in the bloodstream. It accumulates. You get leaky brain. It accumulates in the brain. Nobody's checking the prodromal period with the right test to identify the inflammation that's there, killing off tissue, killing off tissue, killing off tissue. And then eventually you start getting symptoms. So that's the big picture view. I know it's geeky stuff, but I'm hoping that you will listen to this again and again. You listen to this interview, you listen to these points, because it's so important to get the big picture. Where is my inflammation coming from?